Yeah, our next guest is Lara. She is now here and she is from Jordan. And we know each other since we both worked for a while in the same NGO based in Bremen, Border, which is active in the international water and sanitation sector. And she was in our Jordan office. And nowadays she works for the, let's say, famous Stockholm Institute for Water, International Institute for Water. And yeah, today she is here as our expert for Middle East and Northern Africa, and she will give us an introduction to a kind of case study what she is doing in Libya. So welcome, Lara, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. A pleasure to meet you all. I'm sorry I couldn't come in a lot earlier, but Autumn, what you said the last 10, 15 minutes was very inspiring. And I really hope maybe one day you can also teach all your lessons learned to many African Arab countries as well. Okay. Christoph and I spoke, we talked about how we can maybe share a case study. And today I'm going to be sharing some information about Libya. I've been studying Libya for the past, let's say, year. And one of the major things that we've done recently is that I've studied how different climate hazards affect Libya on a national scale, but more particularly on the WASH sector, which also obviously incorporates with the social aspects of everything. And I do understand from Christoph is that he might want me to concentrate a little bit more on the social aspects, because at the end, why are we doing everything if we don't really concentrate on the social aspect? I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. I am just checking how I can do that. Just a second. I don't usually use Zoom. Perfect. Can you see my screen?
Now it starts sharing. Yes. And now you have to go to the presentation modus, and then we have a nice
Okay,
presentation.
perfect. Sorry. Okay. So what we want to talk about is heat waves. The distinct thing about heat waves is that when we talk about heat waves, we're talking about mostly about temperatures only. However, the issue that we saw in Libya was more than just increases in temperature, because heat waves trigger many other things. And from what I've seen is that heat waves have trigger droughts. They trigger more than one issue, but mostly drought is the most prominent risk that will affect the WASH sector and populations in the future. Just a little context about Libya, if you don't know enough about it. You can see from the map that Libya is the second biggest country in North Africa. It is an Arabic country and has been experiencing severe climate hazards in the past decade. And I'm sure you've all heard about the Derna flooding, which we can also directly connect to extreme heat and heat waves later on in our conversation. The idea is that Libya is experiencing extreme heat waves and are becoming more frequent and more intense. And this is one of the ways we study hazards. So when we talk about hazards, we talk about their intensity, their frequency, their geographical extent. We talk about when they come in the year. And at the very end, once we characterize what the hazard is, we then talk about how it impacts different issues and different systems, which obviously include social and WASH systems. It's also good to know that on the side, we're not only talking about extreme heat when we're talking about Libya, we're talking about sea level rise as well, and extreme flooding. As an overview, Libya has a population of around 7 million. And 80% of the population live in urban areas. 4.6% of the population are aged over 65, which gives you a very big indication that a lot of the population are between 24 and they're like 50s. 18% of the population are aged between 15 are youth, categorized as youth. You have a huge number of people who are internally displaced. Keep in mind, these numbers are as accurate as we'd like them to be, coming from UN agencies. However, the estimated number is usually higher. You also have a huge number of refugees and asylum seekers from African countries that want to make their way to Europe. And what happens is that they try to cross, however, they end up staying, in many cases, they end up staying in Libya. And with the huge internally displaced IDPs and refugee crisis, that makes it obviously harder for communities to adapt to different climate shocks. The Children's Climate Risk Index has found that children in Libya are faced with a very high risk of climate and environmental shocks, which is a very clear indication that when we do talk about extreme heat, children are going to also bear the brunt. Also, this index also signifies that children are not only going to experience one climate hazard, but a mix of them, which makes it even worse for many children. Let's talk about what we already know. So, the observed annual average mean surface air temperature in Libya in the past reveals that there's a long-term warming trend, very clear, particularly from the 1970s onwards, which is very close to the projections or the historical projection worldwide, keep in mind. There's obviously from the 1970s up to the current moment, you have an increase in temperature, but you can also see that there was a huge bump in the 2000s. Let's talk about projections. So this graph showcases the projected temperatures up to 2100 based on the World Bank climate information and data. And you can see that the increase in temperature in Libya is highly connected to how well we do with emissions. Because if we go for the low emission scenarios, the increase is not that bad. But the minute we go business as usual or worst case scenario, we're talking about scenarios with high emissions, and if nothing actually changes, which makes it a grim truth after what's happening right now, and after COP29, it's for people like me who work in the sector, it was a very big disappointment because these projections will probably happen. And as you can see, the temperature will soar with high emission scenarios. This graph showcases, just like what we said, but it also showcases its geographical extent, because in many countries, you can see a huge difference in certain areas in every country. With a huge country like Libya, you'd expect that the southern region, which is closer to obviously to the desert area, would experience high temperatures only. But this graph showcases that even with a 3-degree global temperature increase, the whole of Libya is going to be impacted. And that basically says that people in the south, in the north, wherever they are, will be impacted. So the latest CLAC report showcased this very nice graph. The CLAC report was produced in 2023, if I'm not mistaken, for Libya. And it showcases that extreme heat risk, that's what I just told you. So from what you can see, the whole country is already at a very high risk. And you still have extremely high risks, which are closer to the to the shore, to the coastline, rather than the Sahara, which makes it even worse, because this means that the expectations of what is going to happen in the future is going to be worse. So what does extreme heat trigger? I'm sure you probably already covered this in the first parts of the sessions today, but in Libya, it triggers or the highest risks of triggers are connected to drought and floods. And what happens is that with increased evaporation and reduced soil moisture, the ground will no longer be able to absorb extreme rain events, which do happen. And if we talk about the hazard of precipitation, we have learned that the intensity of flooding and extreme 5-day rainfall is going to increase in intensity and in frequency. And that is obviously directly connected to heat waves and directly connected to droughts, because it's a vicious cycle. The drier it is, the harder it is to absorb all the water, and there's increased runoff and so on. And obviously with the increased intensity of rainfall, floods are going to occur and are going to overwhelm systems that are not ready to adapt and that are not climate resilient, and disasters like Derna might happen again. Another thing we obviously have to talk about and not forget is the stress on water resources. Extreme heat obviously increases the demand on water, which is already a huge problem in Libya, but they've been trying to overcome that with desalination plants. However, with sea level rise and their huge dependency on groundwater and their huge project, which is called the Great Man River project, which basically pumps water from aquifers, deep aquifers in the desert, and they pump them to coastal areas and urban areas. Increases in heat waves are going to obviously affect and stress water resources that are already scarce, and is going to create huge problems in the future for people, agriculture, and wash systems. So when we talk about social impacts, usually we talk about economic losses. So we're talking about impacts on agriculture, tourism, and other sectors. And obviously how that affects hygiene and wash sector and the wash sector. And so it basically threatens human health. But I wanted to go back to the idea of how heat waves actually affect drought. And that when you look at these graphs that have been created recently, you can see that severe droughts are expected in the middle of the country, where usually most of the agriculture is situated, which means that it's going to get harder and worse for people. The way we study exposure is that, at least the way when we do think about wash systems and concentrate on the wash sector, we talk about 4 major issues. We talk about water resources, we talk about populations, we talk about water infrastructure and sanitation infrastructure. And from our drought exposure assessment, we realized that the top 6 exposures for drought were increased in demand, livelihood and crop yield problems, a huge decline in income, and huge possible percentages in migration because of the loss of income, because that's directly related, obviously, to crop yield. And then you've got water quality issues, because with increasing in salinity with groundwater resources, that's going to be a problem. Obviously, that is connected to lower reservoir levels and lower water tables. This is a map which is also found in the CLAC report for Libya. And it kind of showcases how water scarcity, the risk of water scarcity is going to be extremely high in the areas where where we just saw that drought is going to obviously be triggered in the middle of the country and on the coastal areas of Tripoli and so on, because these are highly urbanized areas that are highly dependent on groundwater. So the last thing we always have to think about is how does the country's vulnerability affect the hazard impact? Because at the end of the day, the impacts of hazards on different countries can only become better or worse based on the country's vulnerability. And the way we study vulnerability is based on 6 different components. We talk about social, human vulnerabilities. We talk about environmental vulnerabilities, financial, institutional, and at the very end, political issues as well. But I have just summed up a couple of points because the vulnerability study for Libya was huge. But for this presentation, I just summed up a few points to just majorly think about how these human and social vulnerabilities are interconnected to how heat waves and drought affect populations in specific. So one, you have internal conflict and violence. We do know that since 2011, the civil war has been going on. There's a huge instability. Governance in the country is very fragmented, which obviously plays a huge role in how the country itself becomes resilient and or can adapt to certain shocks. We also cannot forget the poverty and human development indices for Libya. There's a high poverty ratio. The Human Development Index for Libya is ranks as 92 out of 193 countries. The GNI, which basically provides an aggressive measure of income, per capita has decreased by 26% since the 1990s. So these issues cannot be forgotten when we do think about impacts of shocks. Another major issue, is the inaccessibility of basic services. So we're talking about wash services, we're talking about water, sanitation, and hygiene services, we're talking about education. And the latest report showcases that around 900,000 people experience acute humanitarian need, which is catastrophic in a country like this. When we also need to think about social inequity. So Libya ranks around it is the 41st country when it comes to gender inequity. Women labor force participation is low in comparison to men. Another thing is that just like we discussed before, there's a huge humanitarian need when it comes to refugees and internally displaced people, which makes it obviously worse because these populations desperately need a lot of services. And there's a huge agricultural decline, which makes it even worse with heat waves because only 12% of the land in Libya is arable, which makes it harder with increases in drought, in heat waves, and with all of these vulnerabilities coupled together, it makes it worse. I honestly did not want to finish this presentation on a grim view, but what I can tell you is that there are many organizations right now working in Libya to really try and create a climate resilient system atmosphere, and CWE is one of them. Organizations like GIZ and UNDP are also playing a big role in pushing the country to also come up with their NDCs and their first NDC and NAP report. And I think that might be a very good step. So maybe fingers crossed. So in the future, in the next 2 to 3 years, I really hope that we can see some change that would enable communities to become more resilient to climate shocks like this. Thank you. And I'm open to answer any questions you have.